They say time heals, but no one talks about what it leaves in its place. My time didn't heal. It only covered the damage with routine and silence. I was Althea Maren, the pastor's daughter, the living portrait of the obedience everyone expected. I grew up being the example, the one who knew the verses by heart, who never caused trouble, who smiled even when her soul wanted to weep. They taught me that God sees everything, but they never explained what to do when it felt like He wasn't seeing my heart slowly breaking apart. When the man I was supposed to marry traded eternal vows for someone else's arms, and so close, to the altar, no one asked how I felt. They hugged me, prayed for me, said it was deliverance. But at night, alone, lying in that cold bed in the room where I grew up, all I felt was shame. Not for being abandoned, but for no longer being able to feel faith as I once did. I followed the liturgy, said amen with my mouth, but doubted with my heart. I cared for my father with devotion, as his cough grew deeper, as if he were being slowly carried away by the wind. His illness was visible, mine was not, and that made me invisible too. It was in this state, exhaustion masked by kindness, that I saw him for the first time. He stood across the street, next to the truck that brought him, carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. The kind of man the whole town whispers about before even knowing his name. Broad shoulders, a guarded face and eyes so deep they seemed carved by force, as if he'd been through something unspeakable. But I saw the pain before a single word, and for a moment, just one, my heart stirred. It wasn't attraction, it was a mirror, because that man, a stranger, without a word, reminded me that there was still something alive inside me, something that bled, yes, but wasn't dead. And that scared me more than any judgment from the church, any sermon from the pulpit, any memorized prayer, because if there was still life, there was risk, and I no longer knew how to handle hope. I tried to pretend I didn't notice when he passed me in the market, sleeves rolled up, eyes avoiding everything. But I noticed. I noticed too much. Caleb, that's what I heard them call him at the warehouse, didn't fit in that place. He didn't seek conversation, didn't return smiles, didn't seem to want to be seen. And maybe that's why I saw him so clearly, because he carried in his restrained gestures and low voice the same tension I carried in my chest, that of someone surviving on the inside while trying not to show it on the outside. The days that followed seemed to test my resilience. He appeared more often than chance would allow, in line at the coffee shop, on the park bench, when I sought a few minutes of peace away from the sound of my father's breathing machines, at the hardware store, where his presence silenced even the loudest jokes from the locals. We exchanged no more than a "pardon me" or a restrained nod, but the eyes told stories I didn't dare read, and yet I read them. I caught myself waiting to run into him like someone seeking confirmation that they're not crazy for feeling something they don't understand. But how do you explain to someone that the simple act of seeing a quiet stranger can reignite a memory of what it feels like to be alive? People started to talk. In a small town, exchanged glances become confessions of sin. "Stay away," whispered an older woman after service. "That man has a dark past." And I wanted to reply that the real darkness was what I felt inside, every day, even when I wore white in the choir. But I stayed silent, as I always did, because the pastor's daughter doesn't talk back. She lowers her eyes, swallows her questions, and prays in silence. And it was on one of those nights, coming back from the hospital after another of my father's declines, that everything changed. Caleb was sitting on the side steps of the church, staring at nothing, hands covered in dirt, as if he dug something or someone out of his own soul. I should have walked past, but I stopped, as if my feet knew what my reason still feared. He looked at me and said nothing, but he didn't need to, in that dense silence between us, I knew. He carried a pain that recognized mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt I wasn't alone in the desert. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion. Just a tough night. Just another wordless conversation with a stranger who, for some reason, was taking up too much space in my thoughts. But when I saw him again, leaning against the truck, covered in grease, wiping his hands with a worn rag, I realized it wasn't exhaustion. It was connection. Painful, unexpected, and above all, unwanted. I passed by him as if nothing had happened, as if we hadn't shared that silence full of everything on the church steps. But when I got home, my breathing was still uneven. And the worst part was not knowing why. He hadn't said anything to me. He hadn't touched me. But there was something in the way he looked at me, direct, without invading, that made me want to lower the defenses I'd built so carefully. My father noticed. Between one cough and another, as I prepared his tea, he said, "I saw you yesterday with the new guy." I didn't respond. I just stirred the spoon at the bottom of the cup, listening to the clinking mix with the sound of his breathing. "People are already talking, Althea." Of course they are, I thought. They talk even when there's nothing to say. But in that moment, I chose silence. I served him with care, adjusted his pillows, wiped the sweat from his forehead, all on autopilot. It was my way of staying useful, of justifying my existence to the world. That night, Caleb came to the service. He sat in the back, far away, as if he didn't want to disturb. But no one enters that church unnoticed. The glances fell on him like blades. I felt every one of them, and even trying to focus on the music, my voice faltered, my throat closed. My eyes met his for a moment, and he just nodded slightly as if saying, "I understand." After the amen before the lights were turned off, he was already gone. Outside, I heard whispers. "What's he looking for here? That type doesn't come to pray. She should be more careful." I got home exhausted, not from the day, but from always carrying the weight of what's expected of me. I locked myself in my room and faced my own reflection. There was something new in my eyes, something I couldn't name. It was as if dormant parts of my soul were, little by little, waking up. And that scared me, because as much as my life had become a minefield of memories and obligations, I still knew how to recognize a heart trying to beat again. And maybe, just maybe, Caleb was bringing to the surface the version of me I thought I'd buried forever. The next day, I didn't plan to see him. I swear I didn't. But the universe has a way of making things seem too coincidental to be just chance. I went to pick up some supplies for my father, and there was Caleb, standing in the hardware aisle, holding a piece of wood as if the whole world hinged on that choice. He saw me, and for the first time, he smiled. Not a wide, intentional smile, but a small gesture at the corner of his lips, shy, almost imperceptible, that sent a strange warmth through my chest. "Hi," he said, as if he still remembered the weight of our silence on the church steps. "Hi," I replied, trying to sound calm, but my hands were shaking. They always shake when the soul wants to flee and the body wants to stay. He asked how my father was, and that was it. No invasive questions, no small talk, no pity. And in that simplicity, there was a respect I hadn't received from anyone in a long time. It was as if he understood that sometimes pain doesn't need explanation. It just needs to be seen. In the days that followed, our encounters were discreet, almost accidental. But inside me, a certainty grew that I didn't want to admit. I looked forward to them. I waited for his deep voice saying, "Good morning" on the sidewalk. I waited for the glance exchanged between pharmacy shelves. I waited for his presence, even if brief, like someone needing a reminder that there was still something beyond obligation. but every light casts a shadow, and the town, with its small eyes and sharp tongues, began to whisper louder. A sister from the church pulled me aside after service and said I should think of my father's legacy before letting myself be fooled. Another commented that Caleb's past was too heavy for good people like you, Althea. And the worst part was that I started to feel dirty just for smiling. I told my father about it one night on the porch. He just held my hand with the strength he still had left. Some pain only time can heal, he said. But some love comes before time. And when it does, you'd better listen. That night, Caleb was waiting for me, leaning against the church fence. The sky was clear, but there was something in the air, a tension, a decision about to be born. If this is hurting you, he said, without even greeting me, I'll leave. I didn't say anything right away, because in that moment my heart screamed. Not because he was offering me peace, but because, for the first time, someone was offering me freedom. The freedom to choose without fear. The freedom to feel without needing permission. And for the first time in a long time, I chose to stay and to look at him as if saying without a word, don't go, not now. The days that followed felt suspended in the air, as if time had slowed down just so we could breathe. Caleb started helping with some things at the church, not at my request, but on his own initiative, silent, respectful, steady. It was as if he knew that to enter my life, he'd need to tread carefully first. And that's exactly what he did. He walked slowly, but firmly, into the space I barely noticed I was opening for him. Our encounters became routine. A coffee on the sidewalk, a conversation after service, a glance shared between words we didn't say. I discovered in him a depth that frightened me. There were layers to Caleb that seemed locked with 7 keys, and every gesture, every sigh of his revealed that there was more than pain hidden there. There was guilt. A thick guilt he never named, but that showed in the way he hesitated before laughing, as if he didn't allow himself lightness. One afternoon, it rained heavily. I was stuck on the church porch, and he appeared, soaked, holding an old, crooked umbrella like a shield. He sat beside me saying nothing. The sound of the rain between us was a balm. After a long silence, he said, I lost someone too. And that was it, but it was everything, because he didn't need to tell me the name. I understood from the tone of his voice. Someone he couldn't protect, someone who weighed on his shoulders to this day. That night I dreamed of him, not romantically. I dreamed he held my hand while I broke down, and in the dream he said, you don't need to fix yourself completely to be loved. I woke up with tears in my eyes, because even in the dream it hurt, because it was true. But the town dreams too, and when it dreams, it invents. It was only a matter of time before whispers turned into accusations. They said he came to hide, that he had trouble with the law, that he was dangerous. And when those words reached the ears of some church leaders, the pressure fell on me. He's not one of us, they said, and you have an image to uphold. The image, always the image. As if my heart were a storefront, as if I were born to please, not to live. That same day, Caleb didn't show up. Not at the market, not on the street, not at the church. He vanished, and something in me collapsed with him. Because his absence wasn't just longing. It was as if a part of me had been torn away before it could fully bloom. I spent 2 whole days trying to convince myself he just needed space, that maybe he was reflecting, that maybe the rumors had bothered him more than he let on. But deep down, I knew. Caleb had left, and this time it wasn't a shared silence. It was a goodbye silence. The worst part was realizing how his absence made everything louder. The town seemed even smaller, crueler. The services felt longer, the prayers empty. Even my father, fading in silence, seemed to feel it. One night, as I changed his bed sheets, he touched my hand and said, "You loved him, didn't you?" I hesitated, and only after long seconds did I whisper, "I still do." It was the first time I admitted it out loud, and it was like breaking a dam. I cried right there, kneeling by my father's bed, my head on his frail chest, not just for Caleb, but for me, for the girl who learned to stay silent, for the woman who carried others' pain for so long she forgot her own. The next morning, I found an envelope under the church door. The paper was simple, no signature, but I'd recognize that handwriting anywhere. The words were few, direct, but each carried weight. "You deserve more than I know how to give. But that doesn't mean I don't wish to be that more. I just don't know if I can. If I ever come back, it'll be whole." I read and reread until the ink nearly faded. He hadn't run from me. He'd run from himself, from the past that haunted him, and maybe from a love he thought he didn't deserve. I went home lighter, not because he was gone, but because I finally understood. My story with Caleb didn't depend on the town's approval, nor the church's silence, nor the shadow of a past that wasn't mine. For the first time, I felt that love didn't need to be shouted. It could be lived, even inwardly, even with pain. And in that breaking point, I knew something new was about to begin, even without him. Time passed as only time knows how, without permission, without answers, without promises. Days turned into weeks, and I learned to live with the empty space Caleb left, not as an open wound, but as a living absence that sometimes showed up in small gestures. An empty bench in the square, a forgotten coffee cup on the stove, a song that played without warning and made me pause for a few seconds. But in the midst of that emptiness, something bloomed. I started to speak, not much, not loudly, but enough. I stopped smiling just to please. I began to say no when something hurt me. I allowed myself to miss him without guilt. I started writing thoughts in an old notebook of my mother's, discovering between crooked lines that I wasn't broken, I was being reborn. My father passed on a gray morning with light breathing and a peace I'd never seen on his face. And even consumed by grief, I understood that something in him had been at rest for a while. He'd left me not just the legacy of faith, but the reminder that true faith doesn't demand we erase ourselves to seem righteous. It demands we live, even with fear. It was on the day of the funeral that Caleb returned. I didn't see him arrive. I only noticed his presence when I felt the air change, as if someone had opened a window in a room sealed for years. I turned, and there he was. The same deep gaze, but without the weight that used to bend him. He was thinner, more serious, but there was something different. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of resolve. We greeted each other without words. A look was enough, a long look, heavy with everything unsaid, and everything that could still be. Later he found me on the church porch, the same place where it all began. We stood in silence, side by side, until he said, "I didn't come to ask you for anything, I know. But I came back for you, I know that too." And that was all. In that moment I understood I didn't need promises. I'd heard plenty. What I needed was this: presence, truth, the courage of someone wounded who still chose to return. And for the first time in a long time, my heart didn't stay silent. It beat, whole. In the days that followed, Caleb didn't try to rush anything. He showed up slowly, like morning light coming through the window, without invading but changing everything little by little. He helped with small repairs at the church, brought groceries to my door, and sometimes just walked beside me on dirt roads without touching my hand, without demanding answers. It was as if he were saying, with his body and silence, that he was willing to wait as long as it took. The town, of course, started whispering again. But this time, I didn't bow. I didn't smile to please, didn't cross the street, didn't apologize for living. Because now I knew who I was, not just the pastor's daughter, but a woman with a voice, with choices, with a love no one had the right to judge. One afternoon, while we organized donation boxes in the church basement, Caleb stopped, leaned against the wall and said, "I spent my life believing I didn't deserve a fresh start. I stayed silent waiting. But you showed me that even the weariest souls can find shelter." I approached slowly. I looked at him as if seeing the man, finally without the shadows. He wasn't perfect. Neither of us was. But in that moment, all I felt was that he'd come, back whole, and so had I. "I don't need you to save me, Caleb," I whispered. "But if you want to walk with me, I'm here." He nodded, and it was the first time I felt peace in that embrace. Not like someone clinging out of fear of falling, but like someone holding on because they know they can now walk without hiding. On the last morning of autumn, when the orange leaves had formed a silent carpet around the church, I woke with a strange calm in my chest. It was as if, after so long carrying the world on my shoulders, it had finally found its place. I got up without haste, put on my worn coat, and headed to the backyard garden, where the plants my father loved so much still resisted time. Caleb was already there, shovel in hand, forehead sweaty, preparing the soil for the new seeds we wanted to plant together. He looked at me and smiled that reserved smile, like someone who learned to smile only after much pain. And I felt, without needing words, that something in us had solidified. That this love, discreet, deep, almost silent, had won not because it was perfect, but because it was chosen, even when everything seemed against it. "This soil still gives life," he said, pointing to the ground he was digging. "So do we," I replied. There were no marriage proposals, no grand speeches. There was just presence and resolve. Caleb stayed. I stayed. Not because it was easy, but because it was true. We began rebuilding what remained, the church, the house, ourselves. He told me, bit by bit, about the brother he lost on the road because of his mistake, about the escape, about the years in silence. I told him about the fear of never being enough, about the weight of the Maren name, about the guilt of wanting something different from the life I was given. And in the midst of those truths, harsh at times, we were healing. The town? It learned. Not quickly, not completely, but it learned. Because when two broken hearts unite and bloom before everyone, even without fanfare, even without official blessing, it teaches more than any Sunday sermon. Today, when I walk hand in hand with Caleb down the main street, I hear whispers, but they no longer hurt me. Because I've learned there's no shame in loving someone who's also learning to love themselves. And if there's still any doubt, just look into our eyes. We're not two who saved each other. We're two who chose to love with their scars exposed, and because of that, survived.